The crashing waves thundered against the towering coastal cliffs like the heartbeat of an angry sea. As Lira stood trembling in the center of the grand ceremony platform, her simple omega robes whipping wildly in the salty wind, the assembled nobles and scholars stared with mocking eyes, their laughter already bubbling beneath the surface as King Kaelen, the Alpha King himself, pointed at her with unyielding authority. Your ocean-fearing cowardice is an embarrassment to this throne, and to the mate bond one refused to acknowledge, he declared, his voice echoing across the cliffs with finality. Banished to the outer reaches, you are no longer welcome in these halls. The words struck Lira like a physical blow, her heart shattering as humiliation washed over her in crushing waves, all her quiet years of service dismissed in a single moment by the man destiny had chosen for her. Tears stung her eyes as she turned and ran, her footsteps pounding against the stone path leading straight to the cliff's edge, where the sea roared below like a living creature waiting to swallow her pain. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I'd love to know how far this story reaches. As the palace lights faded behind her, Lira wrapped her arms around herself, the wind carrying away her broken sobs, while the faint pull of the rejected mate bond lingered in her chest like a distant echo. She stopped at the very brink of the cliff, her toes curling over the edge as the waves crashed far below, and in that moment of utter despair she whispered her grief into the deep, the words tumbling from her lips like fragile offering. Little did the Alpha King know that by casting her out, he had sent away the one soul the ocean itself had chosen to protect the kingdom from the enemy ships now lurking on the horizon. The salty wind whipped across the rugged cliffside settlement like an endless sigh from the ocean itself, carrying the distant roar of waves that crashed against the jagged rocks far below, where Lira moved through her invisible days with a quiet grace born from necessity rather than choice. The small cluster of weathered wooden huts nestled against the cliffs housed the forgotten omegas and lower betas who had been cast from the coastal palace just as she had, and each morning began with the same rhythm of menial labor under the stern watch of alpha overseers who rode their sturdy horses along the narrow paths, their commanding voices barking orders that left no room for complaint. Lira would rise before dawn, her simple shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders as she joined the others in gathering seaweed from the shallow tide pools, her bare feet sinking into the cold, wet sand, while the sea spray misted her face like gentle tears from the very waters she had once feared. The alphas would circle nearby, their eyes sharp and unyielding, making sure every basket was filled to the brim with the slippery green strands that would later be dried and woven into ropes for the palace ships. Faster with those baskets, one would shout, his tone sharp as a blade, and Lira would comply, her head bowed low to hide the quiet defiance that still flickered in her eyes even after the humiliation that had sent her here. In her inner thoughts the rejection replayed like the relentless tide pulling at her heart, the Alpha King's cold declaration echoing through her mind as he had publicly shamed her ocean-fearing nature and banished her without a second glance, ignoring the faint pull of the mate bond that had stirred between them in that fateful ceremony. Yet even as the hurt threatened to drown her, a quiet determination began to take root like the hardy sea grasses clinging to the cliff edges. She was invisible in this place, just another forgotten omega tending to the fringes of the kingdom. But that invisibility offered a fragile freedom to nurture the secret spark that had begun to awaken. Within her soul on the night, she had whispered her grief into the waves. As the sun climbed higher, the labor continued with the omegas carrying heavy baskets back to the drying racks, their muscles aching from the effort, yet their soft conversations weaving a tapestry of shared resilience under the watchful eyes of the alphas. During the midday break, they gathered in the shade of a wind-sculpted rock formation, sharing simple meals of dried fish and bread, the scent of salt and seaweed mingling with the constant crash of the ocean below. An elder omega named Sira, with her weathered face and kind eyes, often sat beside Lira, offering words of comfort that felt like a warm current in the cold sea air. "You carry a heavy burden, child," Sira would say, her voice gentle, yet steady like the steady lap of waves on a calm day. "The palace may have turned its back on you, but the sea has its own ways of remembering those who speak to it truly. Lira would look up, meeting the woman's gaze with a small grateful smile, her heart aching with the memory of the king's rejection, yet finding strength in the elder's kindness. "Thank you, Sira," she replied, her voice soft, but filled with quiet emotion that carried the weight of her unspoken pain. "It is hard to forget how he laughed at my fear of the waves, calling me a coward unfit for any throne. But your words help me hold on to the hope that maybe there is more to my story than banishment." The dialogue brought a measure of peace, but inside Lira's mind the thoughts swirled with greater intensity. The mate bond's faint tug from the distant palace, still causing her heart to ache with unanswered questions. Why had the king rejected her so harshly when destiny had clearly marked them for each other? She pushed the doubt aside, focusing instead on the one thing that gave her strength, the secret. Moments she stole away each evening when the alphas had ridden back to the palace and the settlement grew quiet. In those twilight hours, Lira would slip to the cliff's edge, alone, her footsteps light on the rocky path as she stood overlooking the vast expanse of water that stretched to the horizon like a living mirror of her soul. The waves would crash below with cinematic fury, sending sprays of white foam high into the air, while the setting sun painted the sea in hues of gold and crimson, and she would watch in silent wonder, the inner voice within her whispering questions about the strange power she had felt on the night of her banishment. This place of fear had become her sanctuary, the ocean no longer a terror, but a companion that seemed to listen when no one else would. She practiced in those hidden moments, whispering small fragments of her lingering hurt into the wind, letting the words drift down to the depths, and though nothing dramatic rose from the sea, she felt a subtle shift, a gentle pull from below that made her believe the waters held secrets meant only for her. The days blended into one another, each filled with the same tasks of gathering and weaving, yet Lira's spirit grew steadier with every sunset, the empowering realization taking hold that her invisibility here allowed her to listen to the sea in ways the palace never could. One evening as she stood at the cliff's edge, the wind carrying the faint scent of distant storms, a low rumble echoed from the horizon, not from the waves, but from something farther out or shadowy. Shapes of ships lingered like threats on the water's edge. Sira appeared beside her, then placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, her voice laced with quiet concern. "The rumors speak of enemy warships gathering, child," she murmured. "The kingdom may soon need more than its proud alphas to defend it." Lira felt a shiver run through her, the mate bond stirring with sudden urgency, as if calling her back toward the palace she had fled. Her inner thoughts surged with a mix of fear and unexpected courage, the ocean's distant call blending with the memory of her whispered grief, and she wondered if the sea itself was preparing to answer in ways no one could yet imagine. The Alpha Overseers would return at dawn with stricter orders, but as the stars began to emerge, overhead Lira stood a little taller, her quiet determination hardening into resolve, the mini cliffhanger of the approaching threat hanging in the salty air like the first distant rumble of a storm that could change everything, leaving her heart suspended between the safety of exile and the pull of a destiny only the deep could reveal. The night wind howled across the jagged cliffs like a mournful song from the heart of the sea as Lira slipped away from the sleeping settlement, her bare feet silent on the rocky path that wound toward the very edge where the world seemed to drop into endless darkness. Stars glittered overhead like scattered pearls, while the moon cast a silver path across the restless waves below, painting the ocean in shimmering shades of midnight blue and foam white. She had come here alone after another day of invisible labor, her heart heavy with the weight of banishment and the faint persistent pull of the mate bond that refused to let her forget King Kaelen's cold rejection. The salty air filled her lungs, carrying the sharp tang of seaweed and distant storms, and she stood at the brink, her toes curling over the edge as the waves crashed far below, sending sprays of mist upward like gentle fingers reaching for her. In her inner thoughts, the humiliation from the coastal ceremony replayed in vivid waves, the king's voice declaring her ocean-fearing cowardice and embarrassment to the throne still echoing like thunder in her soul. She had run from that pain straight into exile, Yet here at the edge of everything she felt the sea, calling to her not as a terror, but as something alive and listening, waiting for the words she had never dared speak aloud before. With trembling lips Lira closed her eyes and whispered her grief into the deep, the words tumbling out like fragile offerings carried on the wind. I am afraid, she breathed, her voice soft yet raw with emotion. Afraid of the depths that swallowed my family, afraid of the power that mocks the powerless, and afraid that the man destiny chose for me saw only weakness where I carried quiet strength. The confession poured from her like a tide finally breaking free, every syllable laced with the pain of years spent silent and invisible in the palace halls. For a long moment nothing changed. The waves continued their rhythmic crash, and the wind whipped her hair across her face, but then the ocean answered in a way that stole the breath from her lung. From the black depths below, great bioluminescent creatures began to rise, their massive forms glowing with ethereal blue and silver light, like living stars ascending from the abyss. They circled her position at the cliff's edge, forming a protective ring that pulsed in perfect rhythm with her heartbeat, their gentle hum vibrating through the stone beneath her feet and filling the air with a soothing resonance that calmed the restless waves around the base of the cliff. Lyra's eyes widened in awe, her body trembling not from fear, but from the overwhelming wonder that washed over her like a warm current chasing away the chill of isolation. The creatures did not threaten, they simply surrounded her in a glowing halo, their light painting the night in cinematic beauty, as if the sea itself had risen to embrace the Omega who had been cast aside. Then a voice resonated from the ocean floor, deep and ancient, like the echo of waves through endless caverns, yet gentle and kind as it addressed her by name. Lira, daughter of the tides, it called, the sound wrapping around her like a protective embrace. You who whispered your true pain into my depths have been heard. I name you Tidekeeper, the one chosen to hold dominion over every creature in every sea. Your voice will command the currents, calm the storms, and bend the waters to protect what is just. The gift is yours not through force, but through the harmony of an open heart, the same heart the land above has tried to silence. In that breathtaking moment Lira felt the hidden gift awaken fully within her soul, a profound connection to the living ocean that surged through her veins like liquid starlight. The fear she had carried since childhood, the terror of the waves that had taken her family in a storm, now transformed into something empowering and vast, the very element she once dreaded now answering her call with loyal grace. Her inner thoughts soared with cinematic clarity, the journey from banished coward to Tidekeeper, unfolding in radiant waves, proving that the voiceless could command forces greater than any alpha throne. I am not nothing, she realized, the empowering realization blooming like dawn after the darkest night. My whispers were never lost, they were heard by the deep itself, and now the sea bends to the Omega they laughed at. Tears of overwhelming emotion traced her cheeks as she whispered her thanks back to the voice, the words blending seamlessly with the hum of the glowing creatures that continued their protective ring around her. The mate bond stirred stronger in her chest, a warm resonant pull toward the distant palace where she sensed without seeing the first shadows of danger approaching the harbor, yet she remained rooted in awe, letting the oceanic voice fade into the rhythm of the waves while the bioluminescent being slowly descended back into the depths, leaving trails of light that lingered on the surface like a promise. She stood taller now, her posture no longer bowed by shame, but lifted by the knowledge that the ocean had chosen her, the invisible one, to be its keeper. Yet as the last glow faded into the black water, a low distant rumble echoed from the horizon, not from the cliffs but from the sea itself, where shadowy outlines of enemy warships began to appear on the moonlit waves, their sails cutting the night like blades of threat. Lira felt the call intensify, the gift within her urging her to act, the bond tugging her back toward the kingdom that had cast her out, leaving her heart suspended between the wonder of her awakening and the urgent pull of a destiny that would soon demand she whisper not just grief but salvation into the deep before the blockade closed forever around the shores she once feared. The first light of dawn crept over the cliffside settlement like a hesitant veil of gold and rose, yet it did nothing to soften the heavy ache that settled deeper into Lyra's chest after the night the ocean had named her Tidekeeper. She moved through the morning mist her bare feet, leaving faint prints in the damp sand as she joined the other omegas at the tide pools where the seaweed harvest waited like emerald ribbons scattered by the sea itself. The air carried the sharp salt and brine that once filled her with terror, but now hummed with a secret resonance. Only she could feel the distant echo of bioluminescent creatures, still lingering in her veins like a living promise. In her inner thoughts the wonder of the previous night swirled with the weight of her hidden gift. The voice from the deep calling her Tidekeeper and granting dominion over every wave and creature. Yet the fear she had carried for so long refused to fade completely. She had whispered her grief into the ocean, and it had answered with light and power, but the memory of why she feared the sea in the first place pulled her back into shadows, pulling at her heart with relentless tide. A short flashback unfolded in her mind like waves crashing against the cliffs of memory, carrying her to a stormy childhood day when she was barely 8 years old, standing on a fishing boat with her parents, their laughter bright against the darkening sky until the sudden squall hit. The alphas in charge had mocked her mother's caution, calling the family cowards for wanting to turn back early, and when the waves rose like angry giants swallowing the small vessel Lira had clung to, the railing her small hands slipping as her parents were torn away into the churning depths, their final cries lost in the roar. The alphas who survived had laughed, even then pointing at the orphan girl and saying, "See what fear brings, the sea claims the weak." That trauma had rooted deep, making every crash of surf feel like a reminder of loss, and every alpha command feel like the same mocking dismissal that had stolen her family. The flashback faded, leaving Lira trembling slightly as she bent to gather the slick strands of seaweed, her fingers working automatically, while the present-day waves lapped gently at her ankles. She straightened and caught sight of Sira, the kind elder Omega, approaching with a woven basket, her weathered face etched with quiet concern under the rising sun that painted the cliffs in warm hues. "Child, you look as though the sea itself has whispered secrets to you again," Sira said, her voice warm and steady like the gentle lap of calm waters after a storm, as she set the basket down beside Lira. The alphas rode out early this morning, speaking of distant ship sightings on the horizon. Rumors say enemy warships are gathering, and the palace grows restless. Lira met her eyes, the emotional weight of the night pressing on her words, yet she kept her voice soft with the empowering resolve that had begun to bloom since the ocean's call. "Sira, I cannot hide what happened last night," she replied, her tone carrying the poetic depth of one who had been named by the deep. "I whispered my pain into the waves, and the sea answered with light and a voice that called me Tidekeeper. It granted me dominion over the waters. The creatures rose to protect me, and now I feel them waiting, listening." The elder's expression softened with understanding, but also with a mother's fear as she glanced toward the distant horizon where faint silhouettes of sails could be seen like dark smudges against the morning sky. "I remember your parents, Lira," she whispered, her hand resting gently on the younger woman's shoulder, the touch offering comfort like a warm current in cold seas. "They were mocked for their caution, just as you were shamed for your fear, and taken by the same waves that now seem to call your name. The alphas fear what they cannot control, and if you reveal this gift they will call you dangerous, or, worse, a traitor to the throne that already cast you out. Stay hidden, my dear, for your own safety. The kingdom has survived without omegas speaking to the sea before." Lira took a steadying breath, letting the salt air fill her lungs while her inner thoughts surged. With empowering clarity, the flashbacks, pain now blending with the wonder of her gift, transforming fear into something fiercer. Sira's words echoed the lessons of her trauma, yet deep down Lira knew remaining silent would only let the coming danger swallow the kingdom whole. The mate bond's faint pull toward King Kaelen mixing with the ocean's urgent hum, as if both called her to act. "I understand your worry, Sira," she said, her voice gaining emotional strength that rose like a tide of quiet courage. "But if I remain invisible, who will speak for the fearful when enemy ships close the harbor and the sea itself offers its power?" The dialogue hung between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities, as another low rumble echoed from the horizon, this one carrying the distant sound of war drums across the water, not from waves, but from the warships tightening their blockade. Lira squeezed Lyra's hand, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and sorrow. "You have always carried a light brighter than they deserve," she murmured, "but promise me you will be careful. The bond may call, but it does not guarantee the king will listen this time." Lira nodded, though inside her the cinematic vision of glowing creatures and cracking harbor defenses flashed once more, filling her with urgent dread. The kingdom that had cast her out now teetered on the edge of ruin, and only her whispered voice, the one they had silenced, could bridge the gap between past trauma and a future she alone might shape. As the Alpha Overseers appeared on the ridge, their horses kicking up sand, the distant sails grew clearer on the horizon, signaling the blockade's advance, and Lira felt the pull intensify like an invisible current drawing her back toward the palace and the uncertain path that awaited her there. The distant sails on the horizon cut through the morning mist like blades of impending storm as Lira stood frozen at the edge of the tide pool, her basket of seaweed forgotten at her feet, while the mate bond suddenly flared hot and urgent in her chest like a tidal current, pulling her heart toward the coastal palace she had fled in shame. The Alpha Overseers barked orders from the ridge, their voices sharp against the crash of waves, but she barely heard them, her inner thoughts surging like the sea itself after the night the ocean had named her Tidekeeper. The gift hummed within her now, a living connection to the depths that made every crash of surf feel like a whispered promise, and she sensed without seeing the panic rising in the grand halls where King Kaelen stood surrounded by his advisors, the air thick with salt and fear as scouts reported the enemy warships closing the harbor in a tightening blockade. She could feel the king's presence through the bond, a faint echo of his commanding stance now edged with the first cracks of uncertainty, yet she remained rooted in her own perspective, the empowering realization blooming brighter with every passing second. This was the moment the deep had prepared her for the call she could no longer ignore, because the sea itself stirred with restless energy, responding to her hidden title as Tidekeeper. Lira touched her arm gently, her voice breaking through the roar of waves and inner turmoil. "Child, the ships are real, and they fly colors we do not know," she murmured, her tone laced with quiet dread. "The Alphas speak of blockade, and the palace will send riders soon, but you must stay hidden here where the sea protects its own." Lira turned to her friend, the cinematic sweep of the cliffside settlement framing their conversation. Like a painting of quiet courage amid gathering threats, the morning light dancing on the water in shades of gold and silver, while distant seabirds cried overhead as if carrying warnings from the deep. "Lira, I feel it stronger now," she replied, her voice soft yet resonant with the poetic depth of the old god tongue that blended naturally with the ocean's rhythm. The mate bond pulls, and the sea whispers of danger closing around the harbor. "I cannot remain invisible when my gift was given for moments like this, the creatures that rose for me last night wait below, ready to answer if I only speak." The elder searched her eyes for a long moment, then sighed with reluctant understanding, pressing a small satchel of dried herbs into Lira's hand. "Then go with the blessing of the forgotten," she said, her words warm and protective like a gentle current in cold seas. "But remember the king who banished you may not see your light even now. The bond calls, but it does not erase the laughter that once shamed you." Lira embraced her tightly, the warmth of their chosen family bond stronger than any royal decree, offering a fleeting comfort before she pulled away, her steps quickening along the rocky path that led away from the settlement toward the winding cliffs overlooking the kingdom's harbor. The wind whipped her hair, and the salt spray kissed her skin as she moved with purpose, the inner voice within her growing louder and more confident with every stride. "This is my moment," she thought, the empowering realization chasing away the shadows of childhood trauma and public rejection. The powerless Omega they called coward now carries the voice that can command the tides, and if the sea answers me again, it will prove that fear transformed becomes the greatest strength. The path rose higher, the cinematic beauty of the coastal landscape unfolding around her, the cliffs dropping sharply to the churning waters below, while the distant harbor came into view, its once busy docks now shadowed by the dark silhouettes of enemy warships forming a blockade that choked the trade routes like an iron fist around the kingdom's throat. She paused at a high vantage point, her breath steady as she closed her eyes and whispered the first true command into the deep, her voice blending with the wind in a melodic plea that carried the ancient resonance of the Tidekeeper. Calm the currents, she breathed the words flowing like liquid starlight. Rise gently, creatures of the deep, and show me the path I must take to reach the one who needs this power most. The ocean responded almost immediately, the waves near the cliffs glowing with faint bioluminescent light as smaller creatures surfaced in a protective ring around the base of the rocks, their hum vibrating through the stone and steadying the restless surf that had begun to churn with the blockade's distant cannon fire. Lira felt the gift surge stronger, the dominion granted by the oceanic voice allowing her descent. The harbors panicked through the water itself, the king's advisors shouting reports while Kaelen stood tall on the palace balcony, his powerful frame rigid against the threat, yet she caught a flicker of his inner doubt through the bond, a hesitant recognition that the Omega he had banished might hold the key. Though she did not enter his perspective, the emotional thread carried his growing urgency, brushing against her spirit like a warm wave urging her forward. She continued her whisper, the words weaving a longer incantation that painted inner visions of glowing paths through the sea, guiding her steps along the cliff trail, while the bioluminescent beings followed below, their light marking a safe route through treacherous rocks. Hours blurred into a rhythmic journey of voice and movement, the phrases never ceasing as she intervened from afar, steadying a sudden surge of waves that threatened to crash against the outer harbor walls. The language poured from her with increasing fluidity, each syllable laced with the rich imagery of protective harmony, calming the restless waters and buying precious time for the kingdom that had once cast her out. Her body grew weary from the travel and the emotional expenditure, yet her spirit soared with every successful pulse of response from the sea. This is my redemption, she thought, the inner voice strong and unwavering. Not through the king's favor, but through the gift that turns my silence into salvation, proving that the voiceless can command what the powerful cannot even see. The landscape shifted as she drew closer to the capital, the wild cliffs giving way to cultivated coastal paths where faint smoke rose from signal fires and guards shouted alarms about the tightening blockade. Lira pressed on, her clothes damp with sea spray, but her resolve unbreakable as the mate bond thrummed louder, now pulling her toward the palace gates visible in the distance through the thinning mist. She sensed the king's figure more clearly, his guards in full alert as another wave of enemy cannon fire echoed across the water, and she knew her distant whispers had only bought moments. The true confrontation awaited within the walls, where the Alpha King would soon face the mistake that had sent her away. Exhaustion weighed on her like the pull of the tide, yet she whispered one final command, the sea responding with a gentle current that steadied the harbor's edge. And as she approached the outer cliffs, a massive new surge of warships advanced, their sails swelling like dark promises of assault. In her mind she saw the harbor's defenses straining, the king's voice rising in command yet edged with the first hints of true desperation, and she knew the bond and the deep called her to his side, at last leaving her heart suspended on the edge of revelation as the palace gates came into view and the ocean's voice whispered one last urging before the blockade could crush everything the kingdom held dear. The storm descended upon the coastal cliffs like an ancient fury unleashed, sweeping across the jagged rocks with sheets of driving rain that hammered the stone and turned the narrow paths into slick, treacherous ribbons of water. Lira pressed forward, her simple shawl now soaked through, clinging to her frame as lightning cracked the sky, illuminating the twisted branches of wind-sculpted trees that bent and groaned under the gale's relentless assault. Each step splashed through puddles reflecting fractured images of her determined face, the cinematic fury of the weather mirroring the turmoil within her soul, yet she did not falter, the mate bond pulling her onward stronger now like an invisible tidal thread woven from starlight and destiny. Tugging at her heart, with every heartbeat drawing her closer to the capital, where she sensed the Alpha King's presence amid growing peril. Her inner thoughts swirled in a poetic dance of hesitation, and courage, the voice of doubt whispering, reminders of the public humiliation at the coastal ceremony, the king's cold dismissal that had branded her ocean-fearing coward and unworthy, ignoring the subtle pull of the mate bond that had stirred between them in that fateful moment.
Welcome back to our channel. Today Mott V brought you a brand new and incredibly captivating story, sure to please you if we watch the whole video. This story is entirely fictional. The video was created using artificial intelligence AI and is designed to provide positive entertainment and educational value to viewers aged Muiba and up. Now let us continue exploring today's story.
While returned to the place that cast her out, she wondered, her mind heavy with the weight of past trauma and the childhood loss that still echoed like distant thunder. What if her gift failed? What if the nobles laughed again, reducing her whispered commands to the delusions of a banished Omega? Yet beneath the fear burned a fiercer flame, the empowering realization that her voice, the one they had silenced, now held the power to steady a fracturing harbor, and the bond's call felt like a quiet promise that her journey from powerless to purposeful was unfolding exactly as the deep intended. Thunder rolled across the cliffs, shaking the ground in harmony with the deeper surges from the sea. And Lira paused beneath a cluster of storm-lashed pines, her breath coming in steady gasps as she closed her eyes to focus. The rain streamed down her cheeks like tears of the ocean, washing away the last traces of hesitation. And in that moment she felt the bond sharpen, a warm resonant pull that connected her directly to the palace balcony where King Kaelen stood in his grand chambers, his guards shouting reports of waves rising dangerously high against the harbor walls. She could not see through his eyes, but the threat allowed her to sense the urgency, the way the blockade tightened and the enemy cannons thundered while the sea itself rebelled under the strain, threatening to flood the docks and swallow the kingdom's last defenses. Without words, she knew he faced the danger alone, his pride still shielding him from admitting the mistake that had banished the very soul capable of helping. Her courage surged like the storm itself, and she lifted her voice above the howling wind, whispering the ancient command into the deep, the Tidekeeper's words flowing from her lips in resonant waves that cut through the rain like shafts of moonlight. The phrases were not shouted, but woven with emotional depth, each syllable a tender plea for balance, a harmonious incantation that painted cinematic visions in her mind of glowing creatures rising to calm the restless currents and steady the harbor's edge. She spoke of protection and restoration, her voice carrying the poetic beauty of forgotten tides that had once guarded the realm for centuries. And as the words built in power, she felt the rising waves near the palace respond. Far away in the capital, the surge that had threatened to crash over the outer docks eased. Violent swell, the waters glowing faintly with bioluminescent light, before beginning to settle with a soft sigh of ancient harmony. Lira's inner thoughts filled with awe and quiet triumph. See, she told herself, the empowerment blooming within her like a flower after long winter. My whisper reaches where armies cannot. The powerless one they rejected now steadies the kingdom from afar, proving that true strength lies not in alpha command, but in the quiet harmony of what was once dismissed. The storm seemed to listen to the rain, softening slightly, as if the elements themselves bowed to the Tidekeeper's call flowing through her. Yet the mate bond deepened in that instant, sending a rush of warmth through her veins, a subtle echo of the king's surprise and confusion that brushed against her spirit like a hesitant caress. She wondered if he felt her presence now, if the faint pull he had ignored at the ceremony now tugged at him with undeniable force, making him question the arrogance that had led to her banishment. No dialogue passed between them across the distance, but the emotional connection spoke volumes, her courage feeding into the bond, while his growing uncertainty whispered back through the thread. She continued her whisper, her feet moving forward again through the storm-lashed meadows where flooded coastal paths reflected the lightning like shattered mirrors of the world's fragility. Hours blurred into a rhythmic journey of voice, and stepped the words never ceasing as she intervened. From afar, steadying yet another surge that threatened the inner harbor wall. The language poured from her with increasing fluidity, each phrase laced with the rich imagery of protective light weaving through currents and calming the restless sea before it could fully overwhelm the kingdom's defenses. Her body grew weary from the travel and the emotional expenditure, yet her spirit soared with every successful pulse of response from the deep. "This is my redemption," she thought, the inner voice strong and unwavering. "Not through the king's favor, but through the gift that transforms my silence into salvation." The lands shifted from open cliffs to the forested outskirts of the capital, the trees providing brief shelter from the relentless rain as she pressed on, her clothes heavy and salt-stained, but her resolve unbreakable. In a small clearing, she paused again to catch her breath, the mate bond now humming like a living melody in her chest, pulling her toward the palace gates visible in the distance through the thinning storm. She sensed the king's figure more clearly, now his powerful presence standing at a balcony overlooking the harbor, his guards around him, as another surge tested the waters she had just calmed. Her voice rose once more in a longer whisper, the Tidekeeper's command wrapping around the failing currents like gentle arms offering solace and strength. The sea steadied fully, this time the distant thunder fading into quiet, and Lira felt a wave of exhaustion mixed with profound fulfillment wash over her. Yet as the words faded from her lips, a new urgency gripped her heart, the bond suddenly flaring with a sharper intensity that carried hints of the king's inner turmoil, a flicker of regret perhaps, or the first crack in his pride. She quickened her pace, the city walls looming ahead, their stone surfaces etched with new cracks from the pounding waves, yet standing resilient thanks to her distant efforts. And as she approached the outer cliffs, a massive new surge of warships advanced, their cannons flashing in the distance. The enemy fleet tightened its blockade with renewed force, and she knew her interventions from afar would no longer suffice. The true confrontation awaited within the palace, where the Alpha King would soon confront the mistake that had sent her away, leaving her heart suspended on the edge of revelation as the palace gates swung open under the watch of wary guards who sensed something ancient awakening in the Omega who had returned from exile. The palace outer cliffs rose like ancient sentinels battered by the storm's dying fury, their stone faces glistening with rain and sea spray as Lira staggered the final steps, her legs heavy with exhaustion from the relentless trek along the storm-lashed paths, yet her spirit burned brighter than ever with the empowering fire of purpose that had carried her from exile. The wind still whipped her soaked shawl against her frame, but the mate bond thrummed with urgent warmth, pulling her forward even as fatigue threatened to buckle her knees. She dropped to one knee at the cliff's overlook, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she gazed down at the harbor below, where the enemy warships had tightened their blockade like a noose of dark sails and iron cannons, the cinematic sweep of the scene unfolding in vivid chaos, the once bustling docks now shadowed by rising waves and panicked guards scrambling along the walls, their shouts lost in the roar of the sea. In her inner thoughts, the journey from the cliffside settlement replayed like a tide of quiet triumph, the whispers she had sent ahead already calming surges and steadying currents, proving that the Tidekeeper's gift answered even from afar. Yet the sight of the warships closing in sent a fresh wave of determination surging through her. This was the first true glimpse of the catastrophe. She had come to face the blockade threatening to starve the kingdom and drown its defenses, and she knew her distant commands had only bought precious moments, the deep now calling for her voice to rise closer to the heart of the danger. Guards on the lower ramparts spotted her, then their alpha postures stiffening with suspicion as one stepped forward, his hand on the hilt of his sword. Who approaches the outer cliffs in such disarray? He demanded, his voice rough with alarm carried on the wind. An Omega from the reaches, another added with a sneer. Turn back before the sea claims you too. Lira lifted her head, meeting their gazes without flinching, her breath steady despite the weariness that made her limbs tremble. I am no stranger to these shores, she replied, her tone soft, yet carrying the resonant echo of the Tidekeeper's whisper that lingered from her journey. The blockade chokes your harbor, and only my voice can part what the enemy has closed. Let me through for the king's sake and the kingdom's. The guards exchanged uneasy glances, the panic from the tightening warships still rippling through them as another volley of cannon fire echoed across the water, sending sprays of seawater high into the air. In that instant, Lira did not wait for permission, her voice rising in a distant whisper that flowed from her lips like a gentle yet unbreakable current of ancient harmony. The words wove through the storm in poetic waves, each syllable a luminous thread of light that reached across the harbor and deeper still toward the enemy fleet. She spoke of parting and balance, of restoration, and calm, the Tidekeeper's command painting inner visions of glowing creatures rising to nudge the currents aside, creating a narrow channel through the blockade that allowed a single supply ship trapped inside to slip free toward safety. The sea responded almost immediately, its surface glowing with faint bioluminescent light as the massive waves that had threatened to crash against the palace walls eased their violent advance, the waters parting slightly in a shimmering path that bought the guards precious time to reinforce the docks. The Alphas fell silent, their panic easing into stunned awe as they watched the ocean itself bend to her whispered will, the blockade's grip loosening for the first critical moment. She could feel the king's presence sharpen through the bond, now a fleeting brush of his awareness, like a warm shadow crossing her mind, sensing her arrival and the subtle intervention that had saved the outer harbor from immediate collapse. Though she remained in her own perspective, the emotional thread carried his surprise and the first stirrings of something deeper, a hesitant recognition that the Omega he had banished now steadied the very realm he ruled. Lira's inner thoughts swelled with quiet triumph mixed with lingering vulnerability. She affirmed to herself, the empowering journey from invisible exile to guardian unfolding in every resonant whisper. My gift turns mockery into salvation, proving that the voiceless hold the key to what the powerful overlook. The mate bond hummed stronger in response, as if acknowledging her courage, and she drew a shaky breath, pushing through the exhaustion that clouded her vision. The blockade had loosened, but not broken, its warships still looming like dark promises on the horizon as the enemy captains shouted orders to close the gap once more. She rose slowly, her body protesting every movement, yet her resolve unbreakable as the guards finally parted, allowing her passage along the cliff path with wary nods. One even offered a steadying hand, which she accepted with a grateful nod, her emotional dialogue brief but heartfelt. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice still laced with the ancient melody. "The threat is not over, but together we may yet hold it back." The Alpha who had challenged her earlier cleared his throat, his tone softened by what he had witnessed. "If you speak truth, Omega, then the king must know of your return," he said, leading her forward along the stabilized path. Lira nodded, though her heart ached with the weight of what lay ahead, the slow burn pull of destiny, drawing her closer to the man whose rejection had started this path. The cinematic sweep of the capital unfolded around her, towers and spires now marred by salt and storm, yet standing resilient thanks to her distant efforts. And as they approached the inner palace walls, a deeper rumble echoed from the harbor itself, the largest wave yet beginning to build under the enemy's renewed assault. She sensed the king there, his guards in full panic around him as the sea strained against her earlier command, and she knew the true test awaited, the warships preparing a final push that would demand her voice rise in person before the harbor fell completely, leaving her heart suspended between exhaustion and the fierce determination to prove her worth once and for all as the palace gates came into full view under the stormy sky. The inner palace halls echoed with the frantic shouts of guards and the low, ominous rumble of waves crashing against the harbor walls as Lira stepped through the grand archway, her mud-stained and salt-crusted robes leaving faint trails of the storm-lashed journey behind her. Servants and advisors scattered in confusion, their faces pale under the flickering torchlight, while the air grew thick with the scent of disturbed sea and ancient stone. She moved forward, her heart pounding in sync with the deepening mate bond that now thrummed like a living tide, pulling her inexorably toward the grand balcony, where she knew King Kaelen stood at the center of the chaos. The enemy warships had tightened their blockade. She could feel it through the ocean's hum, the largest surge yet building under the strain, and the cinematic vision of glowing cracks in the harbor defenses filled her mind with urgent clarity. Her inner thoughts swirled with a mix of exhaustion and quiet empowerment, the journey from cliffside Exile to this moment inside the palace heart, transforming her from the silent scholar into a woman, whose whisper carried the weight of the deep itself. Yet as the massive doors to the balcony swung open under the panicked push of guards, she felt a flutter of vulnerability, the memory of her public rejection still lingering like salt on an open wound. King Kaelen stood tall amid the turmoil, his broad shoulders rigid beneath the royal mantle as he barked orders to his advisors, the air around him heavy with alpha command. But in that instant his eyes locked onto Lira, and time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to the sight of the Omega he had banished standing before him, storm-kissed and resolute. For the first time since the coastal ceremony, the Alpha King allowed his perspective to shift inward, the shock hitting him like a physical wave that cracked the armor of his pride. There she was, the woman whose scent had once stirred the faint mate bond he had dismissed as weakness, now returned from the outer reaches, her presence commanding in a way that made the enemy blockade feel suddenly secondary. Guilt flooded him, a deep internal wave that twisted in his chest as he recalled the ceremony, his own voice declaring her ocean-fearing cowardice and embarrassment and ordering her exile, all because he had convinced himself a true king needed fearless strength rather than quiet vulnerability. How blind-eyed was he, thought, the regret blooming like thorns in his mind, the bond's thread now blazing with clarity, showing him the error of his arrogance, the way he had ignored destiny's call and sent away the one soul whose whisper might save them all. His powerful frame remained outwardly composed, but inside the emotional storm raged fierce and unyielding, forcing him to confront the mistake that now threatened everything he ruled. Lira felt the shift in him through their connection, though she remained in her own perspective, her inner voice steady with cautious hope. The king who had humiliated her now looked at her with something raw and unguarded, and it stirred emotions she had buried deep during her exile, the slow burn pull of the bond warming her despite the fear of renewed rejection. She stepped closer, her footsteps echoing softly amid the rumbling surf as guards fell silent, watching the unexpected reunion. Kaelen's voice, when it came, was lower than she remembered, laced with a hesitation that revealed the depth of his internal regret. He began, his tone carrying the weight of unspoken questions as he dismissed the advisors with a sharp gesture, leaving them alone on the windswept balcony. The Omega from the ceremony, the one I sent away. Why have you returned now, when the sea itself rebels against us and enemy sails choke the harbor? Lira met his gaze, her heart aching with the cinematic beauty of the moment, torchlight dancing across his features, highlighting the flicker of guilt in his eyes that mirrored her own past pain. I returned because the deep called to me, your majesty, she replied, her words soft yet resonant with emotional truth, the Tidekeeper's whisper subtly weaving into her speech like a gentle undercurrent. The blockade you and your nobles dismissed as distant threat now tightens, and only my voice can part what they have closed. You banished me for fearing the sea, but that same sea has answered my grief and named me Tidekeeper. The dialogue hung between them, tentative and charged, as Kaelen took a step forward, his powerful presence tempered by the regret that now softened his stance. I see you now, he said, his voice deepening with genuine remorse, the inner switch revealing layers of self-doubt he had never allowed before. On the cliffs that day I laughed with the nobles, convinced your fear made you unworthy, a distraction unfit for a king's side. The mate bond stirred even then, but I rejected it, believing strength lay only in what the world could see. That was my mistake, Lira, and it may cost us the harbor and everything beyond. Her inner thoughts surged with empowering clarity, the king's admission like a balm on old wounds, yet she guarded her heart, knowing the slow burn romance demanded time and proof. She had come not for his favor, but for the kingdom's survival, and his words, though heartfelt, still carried the echo of past authority. I do not seek revenge, she answered, her tone laced with quiet strength and the poetic depth of one who had risen from silence. Only the chance to use what the ocean has given me to protect what we both love. The bond between us may have been ignored, but it led me here through storm and whisper. Kaelen nodded, his regret deepening in the private space of his mind, where he grappled with the full weight of his error, the Alpha King humbled by the Omega's quiet power. Yet even as the emotional exchange built a fragile bridge between them, a violent new surge shook the harbor below, causing the largest wave yet to rise against the docks, and Lira felt the entity, restless energy pressing against her senses, demanding her voice immediately. She knew the revelation had only begun. The king's guilt, opening the door to trust, but the blockade would test them both in ways neither could yet foresee, leaving the air thick with unspoken promises, and the urgent need for her whisper to rise once more before the sea itself turned against the kingdom. The balcony's salt-kissed wind softened into a gentle breeze as King Kaelen led Lira along a hidden stone path that descended toward the private cliff overlooking the harbor, the torchlight flickering like distant stars against the dark water below. The palace walls rose behind them, shielding them from prying eyes, while the sea stretched out in a vast cinematic canvas of moonlight and gentle swells, the enemy warships now distant silhouettes on the horizon after the first calming whisper she had offered. Lira's heart beat in steady rhythm with the mate bond that hummed warmly between them, the king's presence no longer a shadow of rejection, but a quiet anchor that made the night feel charged with possibility. Her inner thoughts flowed like a careful tide. The demonstration on the harbor wall had opened a door, yet she guarded her heart, remembering how quickly pride could slam it shut again. Still in this shared space, standing together at the cliff's edge, the slow-burn intimacy felt real, and earned. Each exchanged glance a step closer to trust earned through storm and whisper. Kaelen stopped at the edge, his powerful fingers resting lightly on the weathered stone railing. His usual commanding presence, softened by the moonlight that highlighted the lines of regret still etched faintly at the corners of his eyes. "These cliffs have seen more than battles," he murmured, his voice low and thoughtful, carrying the weight of partial fault he had begun to voice on the balcony. "I stood here the day I sent you away, convinced your fear of the sea made you weak, unworthy of standing beside a king. That was only part of my mistake, Lira. I failed to see that true power often hides in the quiet places where voices like yours have always waited to be heard by the deep itself." Lira felt the words settle over her like a warm current, the cinematic beauty of the scene wrapping around them both, the moonlight dancing across the water in silver ribbons, while the faint glow of bioluminescent creatures began to pulse just below the surface, as if the ocean sensed her nearness. Her heart stirred with empowering warmth, the invisible Omega now standing as an equal at the king's side, her gift no longer mocked but sought. Yet she tempered the hope with the wisdom of her journey, knowing that worth could not be granted by any alpha, it had to be claimed from within. "I never sought your validation, your majesty," she replied, her tone soft yet resonant with emotional depth, the Tidekeeper's whisper blending naturally with the ocean's rhythm. "All those nights in exile when the world saw me as nothing, I whispered to the waves, and they answered. My worth was never in your palace or your court. It lived in the sea that chose me, the one that turns silence into salvation." She stepped closer to the edge, her bare feet cool against the stone as she lifted her hands toward the water, the mate bond responding with a deeper pulse, sending a shared warmth through them both. Kaelen's gaze lingered on her profile, his inner perspective flickering briefly in this deep moment of reflection, the regret he had confessed now layered with genuine admiration and a quiet ache for the time lost to his blindness. How had he not seen her strength before, the way her quiet resilience outshone the loudest commands in his realm? Admitting fault felt like shedding armor, yet it also felt right, as if the bond had been waiting for this honesty to truly awaken. "You speak of worth as though it was always yours to claim," he said, his voice deepening with sincere emotion as he met her eyes across the narrow space. "And you are right. I built my rule on what the world could see, forgetting that the fearful often carry the greatest light. Your whisper, Lira, it humbles me. It reminds me that power is not taken, but given through harmony with the sea you once feared." In that exchange, the slow burn romance deepened not with grand gestures, but with the simple beauty of two souls bridging the chasm of past rejection, one honest word at a time. Lira's inner thoughts bloomed like night-blooming flowers under moonlight, the king's partial admission and his respect wrapping around her trauma like healing balm, yet she held steady in her empowerment refusing to let the bond rush what needed time to root firmly. We stand together now not as king and outcast, but as partners in this fight, she thought. The cinematic imagery of their joined focus on the water, painting a picture of fragile trust taking shape amid the rising tension of the blockade. She turned toward the sea and began to whisper the Tidekeeper's command flowing from her lips in a melodic cadence rich with poetic resonance, each syllable painting vivid images of harmony and protection. The words wove through the air like threads of starlit silk, gentle, yet unbreakable, coaxing the bioluminescent creatures to rise once more, their massive glowing forms breaking the surface in a shimmering ring that circled the base of the cliff, pulsing in perfect rhythm with her heartbeat. The sea responded with a soft sigh, the restless currents near the harbor settling further the enemy warships rocking gently, as if the ocean itself offered a warning and a promise. Kaelen watched in silence, his breath catching as the creatures formed their protective circle, the light painting the night in ethereal blue, and silver, the king's growing respect shining through like sunlight piercing cloud. Lira felt his gaze like a warm current through the mate bond, strengthening the slow burn connection. Without words, yet her inner thoughts remained cautiously hopeful. He sees me now not as the fearful Omega, but as the voice that can mend what was broken. Still she held part of her heart in reserve, knowing that true partnership required more than awe, it demanded time and shared purpose. As the final syllable faded, the creatures lingered a moment longer, their light dimming slowly back into the depths, leaving trails of silver on the water, like stardust scattered by the Tidekeeper's hand. She turned to meet his eyes, the emotional dialogue building between them like the gentle unfolding of dawn after a long night. "It is not command of force, your majesty," she said, her voice soft with empowering truth, yet laced with the cinematic depth of her journey. "It is harmony. The sea speaks in balance, and I have carried its language not because I sought power, but because it chose the one who was invisible enough to listen." Kaelen stepped closer, the cliff's quiet enveloping them in an intimate cocoon, his tone carrying genuine admiration that deepened the bond's pull. "I was wrong to laugh on these very cliffs," he admitted, the regret from earlier now layered with respect that made his words feel like a bridge being built stone by careful stone. "Your whisper, Lira, it does what my fleets and generals cannot. It heals where I only commanded." In that moment his growing respect shone through like moonlight on calm water, and Lira's guarded hope flickered brighter, though she tempered it with the wisdom of her past trauma. She had calmed the outer surge, and now this private demonstration, but the blockade still loomed, and she knew their slow burn connection would be tested further. "Thank you for seeing it," she replied, her emotional words carrying the weight of every silenced year, now finding their voice. "But this is only the beginning. The greater threat calls louder, and I cannot face the warships alone." Kaelen nodded, his hand finally brushing hers in the lightest of touches, a spark of warmth that sent the mate bond singing through them both. "Then we face them together," he said, the promise in his voice sincere and steady. "You have shown me the error of my ways, and I will not repeat it." Lira's inner thoughts swelled with quiet empowerment, the private moment at the cliff transforming her from outcast to equal in his eyes. Yet as their fingers lingered, a sudden deeper rumble echoed from the harbor, the largest wave, yet beginning to build under the enemy fleet's renewed assault, the warships advancing with fresh sails unfurled. She felt the sea's restless surge pressing against her senses, the calm she had woven now challenged by a far greater force, and she knew that while respect bloomed between them, the true test of their bond and her whisper awaited in the shadows of the coming dawn, leaving the air charged with fragile hope and the urgent whisper of impending crisis. The cliff's edge held them in a cocoon of salt-kissed silence as Lira and King Kaelen stood side by side, the moonlight painting the harbor in silver and shadow while the distant enemy warships rocked gently on the calmed waters like sleeping predators waiting to strike again. The wind carried the soft sigh of waves against stone, and the faint glow of bioluminescent creatures still lingered far below, pulsing like quiet guardians of the deep. Lira felt the mate bond hum between them, a warm, steady current that made the night air feel charged with fragile possibility, Yet she kept her heart guarded the slow-burn trust they had begun to weave still tender after the wounds of banishment. Her inner thoughts flowed like a careful tide. The king's respect at the cliff had cracked the wall of his pride, but she reminded herself that true partnership could not be rushed, not after years of invisibility and the sharp sting of being called coward. This moment overlooking the harbor felt cinematic, almost sacred, the sea stretching out like a living mirror of her journey from mocked Omega to Tidekeeper, yet she tempered the hope with the wisdom of her past, knowing worth had to be claimed, not granted. Kaelen shifted beside her, his powerful frame relaxed in the moonlight, his hand resting near hers on the stone railing without touching, as if afraid to break the delicate harmony building between them. "These waters have seen more than battles," he murmured, his voice low and thoughtful, carrying the weight of partial fault he had begun to voice earlier. "I stood here the day I sent you away, convinced your fear of the sea made you weak, unworthy of standing beside a king. That was only part of my mistake, Lira. I failed to see that true power often hides in the quiet places where voices like yours have always waited to be heard by the deep itself." Lira felt the words settle over her like a warm current, the cinematic beauty of the scene wrapping around them both, the moonlight dancing across the water in silver ribbons, while the faint glow of bioluminescent creatures began to pulse just below the surface, as if the ocean sensed her nearness. Her heart stirred with empowering warmth, the invisible Omega now standing as an equal at the king's side, her gift no longer mocked but sought. Yet she tempered the hope with the wisdom of her journey, knowing that worth could not be granted by any alpha, it had to be claimed from within. "I never sought your validation, your majesty," she replied, her tone soft yet resonant with emotional depth, the Tidekeeper's whisper blending naturally with the ocean's rhythm. "All those nights in exile when the world saw me as nothing, I whispered to the waves, and they answered. My worth was never in your palace or your court. It lived in the sea that chose me, the one that turns silence into salvation." She stepped closer to the edge, her bare feet cool against the stone as she lifted her hands toward the water, the mate bond responding with a deeper pulse, sending a shared warmth through them both. Kaelen's gaze lingered on her profile, his inner perspective flickering briefly in this deep moment of reflection, the regret he had confessed now layered with genuine admiration and a quiet ache for the time lost to his blindness. How had he not seen her strength before, the way her quiet resilience outshone the loudest commands in his realm? Admitting fault felt like shedding armor, yet it also felt right, as if the bond had been waiting for this honesty to truly awaken. "You speak of worth as though it was always yours to claim," he said, his voice deepening with sincere emotion as he met her eyes across the narrow space. "And you are right. I built my rule on what the world could see, forgetting that the fearful often carry the greatest light. Your whisper, Lira, it humbles me. It reminds me that power is not taken, but given through harmony with the sea you once feared." In that exchange, the slow-burn romance deepened, not with grand gestures, but with the simple beauty of two souls bridging the chasm of past rejection, one honest word at a time. Lira's inner thoughts bloomed like night-blooming flowers under moonlight, the king's partial admission and his respect wrapping around her trauma like healing balm, yet she held steady in her empowerment, refusing to let the bond rush what needed time to root firmly. "We stand together now, not as king and outcast, but as partners in this fight," she thought, the cinematic imagery of their joined focus on the water, painting a picture of fragile trust taking shape amid the rising tension of the blockade. She turned toward the sea and began to whisper, the Tidekeeper's command flowing from her lips in a melodic cadence rich with poetic resonance, each syllable painting vivid images of harmony and protection. The words wove through the air like threads of starlit silk, gentle yet unbreakable, coaxing the bioluminescent creatures to rise once more, their massive glowing forms breaking the surface in a shimmering ring that circled the base of the cliff, pulsing in perfect rhythm with her heartbeat. The sea responded with a soft sigh, the restless currents near the harbor settling further, the enemy warships rocking gently, as if the ocean itself offered a warning and a promise. Kaelen watched in silence, his breath catching as the creatures formed their protective circle, the light painting the night in ethereal blue, and Silver the King's growing respect shining through like sunlight piercing cloud. Lira felt his gaze like a warm current through the mate bond, strengthening the slow burn connection. Without words, yet her inner thoughts remained cautiously hopeful. He sees me now not as the fearful Omega, but as the voice that can mend what was broken. Still she held part of her heart in reserve, knowing that true partnership required more than awe, it demanded time and shared purpose. As the final syllable faded, the creatures lingered a moment longer, their light dimming slowly back into the depths, leaving trails of silver on the water, like stardust scattered by the Tidekeeper's hand. She turned to meet his eyes, the emotional dialogue building between them, like the gentle unfolding of dawn after a long night. "It is not command of force, your majesty," she said, her voice soft with empowering truth, yet laced with the cinematic depth of her journey. "It is harmony. The sea speaks in balance, and I have carried its language not because I sought power, but because it chose the one who was invisible enough to listen." Kaelen stepped closer, the cliffs quiet, enveloping them in an intimate cocoon, his tone carrying genuine admiration that deepened the bond's pull. "I was wrong to laugh on these very cliffs," he admitted, the regret from earlier now layered with respect that made his words feel like a bridge being built stone by careful stone. "Your whisper, Lira, it does what my fleets and generals cannot. It heals where I only commanded." In that moment his growing respect shone through like moonlight on calm water, and Lira's guarded hope flickered brighter, though she tempered it with the wisdom of her past trauma. She had calmed the outer surge, and now this private demonstration, but the blockade still loomed, and she knew their slow burn connection would be tested further. "Thank you for seeing it," she replied, her emotional words carrying the weight of every silenced year now finding their voice. "But this is only the beginning. The greater threat calls louder, and I cannot face the warships alone." Kaelen nodded, his hand finally brushing hers in the lightest of touches, a spark of warmth that sent the mate bond singing through them both. "Then we face them together," he said, the promise in his voice sincere and steady. "You have shown me the error of my ways, and I will not repeat it." Lira's inner thoughts swelled with quiet empowerment, the private moment at the cliff transforming her from outcast to equal in his eyes. Yet as their fingers lingered, a sudden deeper rumble echoed from the harbor, the largest wave, yet beginning to build under the enemy fleet's renewed assault, the warships advancing with fresh sails unfurled. She felt the sea's restless surge pressing against her senses, the calm she had woven now challenged by a far greater force, and she knew that while respect bloomed between them, the true test of their bond and her whisper awaited in the shadows of the coming dawn, leaving the air charged with fragile hope and the urgent whisper of impending crisis. The Grand Council chamber glowed under the light of hanging lanterns that swayed gently with the distant rumble of waves outside, their golden beams catching on the long oak table where nobles and scholars sat in tents, rose their ornate robes rustling like dry leaves in the salt-laden breeze that drifted through the open arches overlooking the harbor. Lira stood at King Kaelen's right hand, her salt-stiffened robes a stark contrast to the finery around her, yet she felt no shame, only the inner fire of purpose that had carried her through banishment and storm, the mate bond humming warmly between them like a steady tide anchoring her amid the gathering political storm. Her inner thoughts flowed with quiet strength, the journey from cliffside exile to this hall, transforming her from invisible Omega to the one whose whisper now held the kingdom's fragile hope. Yet she sensed the old hierarchies shifting against her like currents ready to pull her under once more. The lead noble Lord Varen, the same Alpha, who had laughed loudest at her fear during the coastal ceremony, rose first, his voice sharp with accusation slicing through the tense air. "Your Majesty, this Omega's return is an outrage," he declared, gesturing toward Lira with a dismissive wave. "We banished her for cowardice, and now the harbor chokes under enemy sails, as if her presence invites the chaos. How can we trust one who was deemed unworthy by this very council? Her whispers nothing but dangerous superstition meant to undermine your rule." Murmurs rippled through the nobles, some nodding in agreement, while others cast wary glances at the faint bioluminescent glow still visible on the distant water through the arches. Lira felt the weight of their doubt like a physical wave pressing on her chest, yet her inner voice remained steady and empowering, reminding her that this storm of opposition was the very reason her gift had awakened, to give the voiceless a platform to be heard. Kaelen's jaw tightened, his defense beginning weakly as he raised a hand for silence the alpha. Command in his tone tempered by the humility he had shown her at the cliff. The blockade began before her return, he stated, his words measured but lacking their usual force. She has already calmed the outer surges and steadied the currents with her knowledge of the deep. We must listen before we judge. Lord Varen scoffed, leaning forward with renewed venom. Knowledge, your majesty, or treacherous folly. Omegas have no place meddling in the sea's ancient ways. If she claims to whisper to the tides, then let her prove it here and now, or send her back to the cliffs where she belongs before her presence dooms the harbor entirely. The challenge hung heavy in the air, the emotional dialogue crackling with the tension of old hierarchies clashing against emerging truth. Lira stepped forward, her heart pounding, but her posture unwavering, the cinematic light from the lanterns bathing her in a soft halo that made the distant sea glow brighter through the arches, as if the ocean itself listened. She met the noble's gaze directly, her voice soft at first, yet carrying the resonant depth of the Tidekeeper's whisper that began to weave into her words like a hidden melody. I do not seek your approval, she began, the empowering tone lifting her from the shadows of past humiliation. But I will show you what the sea you once mocked can do, because the blockade tightens with every moment we waste in doubt. She turned toward a ceremonial basin at the chamber's center, its still water reflecting the lantern light and the faint, restless energy of the harbor beyond. The nobles leaned in, some with sneers, others with reluctant curiosity, as she lifted her hands and began to whisper the ancient phrases flowing from her lips in poetic waves rich with harmony and light, each syllable painting vivid inner visions of balance and protection. The words coaxed the water in the basin to ripple gently, then glow with soft bioluminescent light that spread outward across the marble floor in intricate patterns mirroring the calmed currents she had steadied earlier. The very sea the nobles had dismissed, now alive and responsive only to her voice. The distant rumble of waves against the harbor walls eased its violent pulse, the water in the basin settling into perfect stillness that left the entire council staring in stunned silence. Lira's inner thoughts soared with triumphant clarity, her whisper had proven vital once more, transforming skepticism into awe and proving that the powerless could reshape the very forces the powerful had ignored. The mate bond flared warmly from Kaelen beside her, his weak defense now bolstered by visible proof, and she felt his respect deepen through their connection. Yet Lord Varen's face twisted with reluctant acknowledgement, while a few nobles exchanged uneasy glances, whispering among themselves about Omegas rising above their station and the danger of trusting the deep's chosen. Kaelen spoke, then his voice gaining strength as he stood taller beside her. She has shown us the truth, he declared, his tone carrying more conviction now. Lira stays and her counsel will be heard. The council will adapt or the kingdom will fall. The emotional exchange rippled through the room, some faces softening with hope while others hardened with resentment, and Lira sensed the major political conflict brewing like a gathering storm just beyond the chamber walls. As the meeting adjourned with murmurs of reluctant agreement, a messenger burst in from the side arches, his face ashen with urgent news. Your Majesty, he gasped, the rival factions in the outer courts have rallied behind Lord Varen. They refuse to accept an Omega Tidekeeper and threaten to challenge her presence before the full assembly at dawn, while the enemy warships prepare a final assault under cover of the next tide. Lira felt the mate bond tighten with resolve, the political storm rising faster than the sea itself, leaving her heart suspended between the small victory in the basin and the high-stakes battle ahead, where her whisper would either rewrite the kingdom's fate or face one last stand against those who clung to the old shadows of fear and dismissal. The council chamber emptied in a flurry of uneasy footsteps and whispered accusations, leaving Lira and King Kaelen alone for a brief moment in the vaulted space where lantern light still flickered like hesitant stars. Her heart still raced from the demonstration in the basin, the empowering rush of proving her gift to the skeptical nobles lingering like a warm glow in her chest, yet she sensed the political storm had only begun to brew. The mate bond thrummed steadily between them, a quiet anchor amid the rising tension as Kaelen turned to her, his eyes reflecting the deeper respect they had built at the cliff. "We have bought time with your whisper," he said, his tone carrying the emotional weight of their slow-burn connection. "But the nobles will not yield easily. Stay close, Lira. I will not let them silence you again." She nodded, her inner thoughts swirling with cautious strength, the journey from cliffside exile to this fragile place of influence feeling like a cinematic triumph painted in lantern light and ancient stone. Yet before she could reply, the heavy doors burst open, once more, this time admitting Lord Varen, a rival alpha noble known for his sharp ambition and close ties to the lead scholar. His broad frame filled the entrance, his ornate robes swirling as he strode forward, flanked by two armed guards whose faces wore matching scowls of distrust. The air thickened with hostility, the cinematic shadows lengthening across the marble floor as Varen's voice cut through the chamber like a blade honed by resentment. "Your Majesty," he began, his tone laced with false deference that barely masked the venom. "This Omega's parlor tricks with glowing water may fool the weak-minded, but I see the truth. She is no savior, she is the cause. Her presence has awakened the sea's wrath, and her so-called gift is nothing but forbidden sorcery meant to undermine your rule." He gestured sharply toward Lira, his eyes narrowing with calculated disdain as the guards shifted closer, forming a subtle barrier that trapped her between the table and the wall. Lira felt the betrayal unfold like a sudden storm cloud, the political conflict she had sensed now manifesting in open accusation. Her inner voice rose with empowering resolve, refusing to shrink into the invisibility of her past. "I have calmed what your fleets could not," she replied, her words soft yet resonant with the Tidekeeper's whisper that began to weave through them like a protective melody. "The blockade tightens because it has been ignored for too long, not because of me." Lord Varen laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling as he stepped even closer, his hand resting on the hilt of his ceremonial dagger. "Then prove your innocence, Omega," he sneered. "Submit to a binding ritual under my supervision, or face the consequences of treason." The guards moved, then their ambush swift and coordinated, one seizing her arm while the other drew a blade meant to intimidate rather than harm in the palace hall. Lyra's breath caught the cinematic chaos erupting around her as the mate bond flared hot, with alarm pulling her focus toward Kaelen. She did not panic, instead drawing on the ancient connection that lived in her blood, her voice rising in an urgent whisper that flowed like liquid starlight through the chamber. The words were not commands, but harmonies of protection and balance, each syllable painting vivid inner visions of glowing barriers weaving around the guards and Varen himself calming their aggression and forcing the drawn blade to lower harmlessly to the floor. The rival Alpha's eyes widened in shock as the ambush crumbled, his guards stumbling back with dazed expressions, the sea's restless energy beneath the harbor momentarily stilled by her gift. Intervention saving not only her own life, but preventing bloodshed that could have torn the council apart. In that instant, Kaelen's perspective shifted inward, the Alpha King's deeper regret surging like a tidal wave that crashed through his soul with merciless clarity. He watched Lira stand tall, her whisper weaving salvation where his own commands had once failed, and the full weight of his initial mistake crushed him anew, the arrogance that had led him to banish her now exposed as the true betrayal. How could I have been so blind, he thought, the internal storm raging fierce and unrelenting, his pride shattering completely in the face of her courage. I rejected the bond, dismissed her as unworthy, and now a rival seeks to destroy the very light I ignored. Guilt twisted deeper than before mingled with profound admiration that made the mate bond blaze between them like a beacon in the darkness. He stepped forward, his powerful presence reclaiming command as he placed himself between Lira and Lord Varen, his voice thundering with newfound conviction. Enough, he declared, the regret fueling his resolve into unyielding protection. Lira has saved us all while you plotted in shadows. Your ambition ends here, Varen, and any who stand against her will answer to me." The rival Alpha recoiled, his face flushing with humiliated fury, yet he retreated with his guards the political. Betrayal laid bare, but not defeated, as whispers of further opposition lingered in the air. Lira's inner thoughts swelled with quiet triumph, the ambush overcome, and her gift once more proving vital, transforming the moment of danger into another step on her journey from powerless to powerful. The emotional dialogue that followed felt like a bridge strengthening between her and the king as he turned to her, his hand gently steadying her shoulder. "You are safe," he said, his tone laced with the depth of his surfaced regret. "And I swear on the bond that connects us, I will never fail you again." She met his gaze, her heart softening further with the slow burn warmth of earned trust, yet the victory felt fleeting as a violent new surge echoed from the harbor, the enemy warships advancing with full force under the cover of the next tide, the largest assault yet beginning to build as the sea strained against the sudden pressure. The air grew heavy with primordial energy, the mini cliffhanger hanging over them like an unfinished symphony as the kingdom teetered on the brink of true catastrophe, leaving her whisper the only hope against the darkness now surging toward the shores with unrelenting fury. The sacred tidal pool lay nestled at the base of the ancient cliffs like a hidden cradle of the sea, its crystal waters glowing faintly with the same bioluminescent light that had risen for her. Whispers the crash of waves echoing like the heartbeat of the deep itself as Lira and King Kaelen descended the narrow stone steps carved into the rock. The air grew thick with salt and ancient power, the moonlight filtering through the narrow opening above, painting the pool in silver and blue hues that danced across the surface like living runes. Lira's heart thundered in her chest, the mate bond pulling her forward with gentle insistence, yet her inner thoughts swirled with a storm of fear and courage, the childhood trauma of losing her family too. The angry waves rising unbidden like a dark current threatening to pull her under even now. This was the high-stakes ritual, the ancient sea rite that would awaken the full Tidekeeper power within her, and she wondered if the ocean that had named her would truly accept the Omega they had banished, or if her voice would falter at the edge of transformation. Kaelen walked close beside her, his powerful presence a protective shield, his hand hovering near her back without touching, as if afraid to break the fragile harmony building between them. "Lira," he said, his voice low and steady, laced with emotional sincerity that filled the narrow stairwell. "I stand with you not as the king who once banished you, but as the man who sees your light. This ritual will test you beyond anything we have faced, but I will guard you with my life. You have already transformed my blindness into belief, and whatever comes I will not leave your side." His words wrapped around her like a warm current, strengthening the slow burn bond that had grown through shared secrets and quiet trust. She turned to him briefly, her gaze meeting his in the flickering light, the cinematic intimacy of the moment etching itself into her soul. "Your protection means more than you know, your majesty," she replied, her tone soft yet resonant with the poetic depth of one who had claimed her worth. "But this awakening must come from within me. The sea speaks in balance, and I trust it will guide us both to the light we need." They reached the pool's edge, the sacred waters lapping gently at the stone lip, the surface shimmering with inner light as if the deep itself waited for her command. Lira stepped into the shallow tidal pool, the cool water rising to her ankles, sending shivers up her spine, yet the fear that had defined her life began to transform before her eyes into a fierce empowerment, the inner voice rising like a triumphant melody. "This is my moment," she thought, the powerless one now standing where alphas had feared to tread. "My whisper will not only calm the blockade, but awaken the queen I was always meant to become, changing the kingdom from oppression to equality, where fear is honored, not shamed." She knelt in the center of the pool, her hands pressing flat against the submerged stone as the mate bond flared brighter, connecting her to Kaelen, who stood at the edge watching with protective intensity, his frame tense yet unwavering. The ritual began without hesitation, her lips parting as the first words of the Tidekeeper's chant flowed forth, rich and melodic, each syllable weaving through the chamber like threads of starlit silk. The language resonated deeper than ever before the pool's surface, igniting in brilliant blue light that climbed the cliff walls while the water beneath her hands warmed with a gentle yet powerful surge. Lira's voice grew stronger, the poetic incantation, painting vivid inner visions of transformation, her Omega essence stirring, as if the ancient sea recognized her as its chosen vessel. The fear dissolved, completely replaced by a radiant empowerment that made her body glow faintly, the air around her shimmering with the promise of change. Kaelen's gaze never wavered, his inner perspective in this vital moment filled with awe and fierce guardianship, the regret of his past mistake now fully redeemed by the sight of her rising power. "You are magnificent," he whispered, his emotional words carrying across the pool like a vow. "The kingdom owes you everything, and I owe you my heart." The dialogue blended with her chant, creating a harmony that strengthened the ritual, the sea responding with a deep resonant hum as the distant enemy warships' cannons echoed louder, yet more contained. Lira felt the transformation awakening within her soul, a subtle shift that promised to elevate her from silent scholar to a force capable of rewriting laws and legacy. Yet as the final phrase built toward its crescendo, the largest wave yet surged against the harbor walls, the enemy assault reaching its peak with a deafening roar that made the pool tremble and the blue light flicker wildly, threatening to overwhelm the delicate balance she had just begun to weave. The high-stakes ritual hung on the edge of triumph or catastrophe, leaving Lira's whisper the only thread holding back the darkness as the awakening power inside her reached its most dangerous and beautiful peak. The sacred tidal pool blazed with living light as Lira's final whisper soared to its crescendo, the Tidekeeper's ancient words pouring from her lips like a river of pure starlight, each syllable wrapping around the surging wave outside with unbreakable tenderness. The violent assault from the enemy warships met her chant, and instead of shattering the harbor, it began to yield, the massive crest glowing brighter, then softening, as if the primordial sea itself recognized the harmony she offered. Blue radiance erupted from the pool's depths, weaving intricate patterns across the cliff walls that mirrored the symbols hidden in the ocean's heart, now alive and dancing in perfect rhythm with her heartbeat. Lira felt the transformation awaken fully within her soul, a subtle yet profound shift that made her Omega aura shimmer with soft inner light, not harsh or blinding, but warm and radiant like dawn breaking after the longest night of fear. The power rose gently through her veins, chasing away every shadow of childhood loss, every echo of the king's rejection, and every wave that had ever mocked her as coward. In her inner thoughts, the journey unfolded in vivid cinematic waves, from the stormy loss of her family to the rainy flight from the coastal ceremony, and the quiet nights on the cliffs when her whisper first stirred the deep. I am no longer the silenced one, she realized with overwhelming empowerment, the language of the sea, flowing not just from her tongue, but from the very core of her being, proving that the powerless could command forces greater than any alpha throne. This light within me was always mine to claim, and now it rises to heal what was broken. The pool responded completely, the restless energy of the distant blockade easing with a deep, resonant sigh that echoed through the chamber like the release of centuries of fear. The enemy's cannons fell silent for the first critical moment, the sea calming in a wide protective ring around the harbor, as if the deep itself had risen to embrace the Omega who had been cast aside. Tears of profound emotion traced her cheeks as she continued the closing phrases, her body glowing with that subtle luminous aura that made her seem both ethereal and deeply grounded, a queen awakening in the heart of the tide itself. Kaelen stood at the pool's edge, his powerful frame rooted in awe as he watched the ritual reach its peak. In this vital moment, his perspective shifted inward, the Alpha King's soul flooding with a wave of redemption so complete it nearly brought him to his knees. All the arrogance that had led him to mock her fear on the cliffs, the cold dismissal that had banished the woman destiny had chosen for him, now stood fully exposed and forgiven in the light of her power. How wrong I was, he thought, the internal regret transforming into pure reverence, the mate bond blazing between them like a bridge of fire and starlight. I saw only weakness where strength beyond measure waited. She who I rejected has become the salvation I never deserved, and in her rising I find my own. Redemption not as a flawless king, but as a man humbled and ready to love with open eyes. His heart swelled with awe at the sight of her glowing aura, the subtle light painting her features with quiet majesty, and he knew in that instant that his rule would never be the same. Lira's chant softened to its closing note, the pool falling into a profound stillness, broken only by the gentle hum of restored harmony. She rose slowly from the water, her legs steady despite the exhaustion that tugged at her frame, the transformation complete in a way that left her feeling both changed and more herself than ever before. Kaelen crossed the space in 3 long strides, his hand reaching for hers with reverent care, the touch sending a warm surge through the mate bond that spoke of partnership earned through trial and truth. "You have done what no one else could," he said, his voice thick with emotion, carrying the depth of his full redemption. "Your light, Lira, it has calmed what I once let rage through my blindness. I stand here not as your king, but as the man who sees you fully and vows to walk beside you as equal." She met his gaze, her own eyes shining with the poetic beauty of their shared moment, the slow burn. Romance deepening into something enduring and real. "This power was never mine alone," she replied, her tone soft, yet empowering, laced with the resonant echo of the Tidekeeper's whisper. "It belongs to every voice once silenced, and together we will ensure no one is banished for carrying fear again." The emotional dialogue wove between them like the final threads of the ritual binding their fates in harmony, yet as the last blue light dimmed to a peaceful glow, a new surge rippled through the harbor, far above the palace walls, signaling that the blockade's final assault had only paused. The true test awaited in the light of day, where the nobles and scholars would confront the transformed Omega, who now held the kingdom's future in her whisper, and Lira felt the mate bond pull them both upward toward the public confrontation that would either cement her legacy or ignite the final storm of opposition. The grand hall of the palace shimmered under the light of 1,000 crystal lanterns, their glow catching on the newly repaired marble floors where faint blue traces from the calm tides still lingered like whispers of the miracle that had unfolded at the sacred pool. Nobles and scholars filled the long rows of gilded seats, their ornate robes rustling with uneasy whispers as Lira stepped through the towering doors, her transformed aura shimmering with that subtle inner light that made her simple yet elegant robes appear woven from starlit sea foam itself. As the entire court gathered in hushed awe, the mate bond hummed warmly between her and King Kaelen, who walked at her side, his powerful presence no longer a shadow over her, but a steady pillar of shared strength, the slow burn romance between them now blooming openly like the first gentle waves after a storm. Her inner thoughts flowed with cinematic clarity, painting the full arc of her journey from the rainy humiliation at the coastal ceremony where nobles had laughed and the king had banished her as coward, to the storm-lashed cliffs where her whisper first stirred the deep, and the quiet nights when she had spoken her grief into the waves alone, now culminating in this legacy of light that lifted every fearful soul. "I have risen," she realized with overwhelming empowerment, the invisible Omega once mocked for her fear, now stepping into queenship not through force but through the harmony that had healed what pride had broken. Every mockery, every surge, every moment of doubt had led here, proving that the voiceless could claim their place and change the world with nothing but truth spoken to the sea. Kaelen guided her to the center dais, overlooking the harbor, his hand brushing hers with reverent care, the gesture speaking louder than any decree, as he raised his voice, first steady and resonant with the redemption that had reshaped his rule. "The kingdom has witnessed waves that threatened to swallow us whole," he declared, addressing the gathered faces, some still etched with doubt, others softened by the reports of steadied currents. "Yet it was not my command or the wisdom of our generals that restored balance. It was Lira, the Omega once banished from these very halls, whose whisper spoke to the deep and calmed the blockade that choked our shores. She stands before you not as an outcast, but as the Tidekeeper destiny has chosen." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, Lord Varen rising from his seat, his face flushed with lingering skepticism as he pointed an accusing finger toward her. Your Majesty, this display of glowing water and ancient words may impress the fearful, but we cannot rewrite centuries of tradition for one Omega's claims. She was dismissed for good reason, her fear deemed dangerous folly. How do we know her ritual has not merely delayed the end, rather than prevented it? The words struck like echoes of the coastal humiliation, yet Lira felt only a calm fire within her spirit rising unbowed. She stepped forward, her posture tall and unwavering, the cinematic light from the lanterns bathing her in a halo that made the distant harbor glow brighter through the open arches, as if the sea itself listened. I do not ask for your belief, she began, her voice soft at first, yet carrying the resonant depth of the Tidekeeper's whisper that wove through her words like threads of unbreakable harmony. I offer proof through the sea you once mocked, the same ocean that answered my grief and named me its keeper. She turned toward the wide balcony, where the harbor stretched out under the moonlight, the enemy warships still visible but rocking gently in calmed waters. The hall fell into hushed anticipation as she lifted her hands and began to whisper the ancient phrases flowing from her lips in poetic waves rich with emotional truth, each syllable painting vivid images of protection and balance. The words coaxed the distant sea to ripple with soft bioluminescent light that spread outward across the harbor in intricate patterns, calming the restless currents and causing the enemy sails to slacken, as if the deep itself offered a warning and a promise the very tides the nobles had dismissed, now alive and responsive only to her voice. Gasps echoed through the assembly, Lord Varen stumbling back into his seat, his face draining of color as the truth humbled him before the entire court. Lira's inner thoughts soared with triumphant clarity, the public stand transforming every silence year into a beacon that lit the path for others like her. See, she affirmed to herself, the empowering realization blooming like dawn after endless night. My whisper, once dismissed as delusion, now commands what their fleets could not. From invisible to powerful, I rise not for revenge, but to ensure no Omega is ever banished again for daring to carry fear. The mate bond flared warmly from Kaelen beside her, his eyes filled with profound pride as he stepped forward, his hand finding hers in full view of the hall, the gesture sealing their slow-burn romance in the eyes of the court. She has proven her worth 1,000 times over, he said, his tone carrying the depth of his full redemption and the emotional dialogue that bound them closer. I was wrong to reject her, to laugh when she first spoke of the sea's call. Lira's gift has not only saved us, it has shown us that true strength lies in the voices we once silenced. The kingdom will change starting now with her place at my side as queen. Whispers turned to murmurs of reluctant agreement, some nobles nodding with newfound respect, while a few hardened faces still lingered in the shadows. Lira met the eyes of the humbled nobles, her voice steady with quiet empowerment as she concluded the demonstration, the bioluminescent light fading gently back into the harbor. This is not the end of the old ways, she told them, her words laced with the poetic resonance that had won the hall. It is the beginning of balance, where every wolf, regardless of station, may speak their fear and be heard. The kingdom we build together will honor the fearful as equals, for it is they who often hold the light the mighty overlook. Kaelen squeezed her hand, the public affirmation sealing their bond, yet as the assembly began to applaud with growing enthusiasm, a messenger hurried in from the side, arches, his face pale with urgent news. Your Majesty, he gasped, the rival factions in the outer courts have rallied behind Lord Varen. They refuse to accept an Omega Queen and threaten to challenge the new laws before the full council. At dawn, while the enemy warships prepare one final assault under the next high tide. Lira felt the mate bond tighten with resolve, the public confrontation won, but the final political storm gathering on the horizon, leaving her heart suspended between triumph and the high stakes battle ahead, where her whisper would either rewrite the kingdom forever or face one last stand against those who clung to the old shadows of oppression. The grand coronation hall overflowed with the soft glow of morning sunlight streaming through towering arched windows that framed the harbor like a living tapestry of renewal, where once stormy waters now lay calm and shimmering under the Tidekeeper's gentle command and banners of blue and Silver fluttered gently in the sea breeze, carrying the faint scent of blooming tide flowers from the sacred pool below. Lira stood at the center of the dais, her transformed aura shimmering with that subtle inner light that had awakened during the ritual, making her elegant robes appear woven from starlit sea foam. Itself as the entire court gathered in hushed awe. The mate bond hummed warmly between her and King Kaelen, who stood proudly at her side, his powerful presence no longer a shadow over her, but a steady pillar of shared strength, the slow burn romance between them now blooming openly like the first gentle waves after a long storm. Her inner thoughts flowed with cinematic clarity, painting the full arc of her journey from the rainy humiliation at the coastal ceremony where nobles had laughed and the king had banished her as ocean-fearing coward to the storm-lashed cliffs where her whisper first stirred the deep, and the quiet nights when she had spoken her grief into the waves alone, now culminating in this legacy of light that lifted every fearful soul. I have risen, she realized with overwhelming empowerment, the invisible Omega once mocked for her fear, now stepping into queenship not through force but through the harmony that had healed what pride had broken. Every mockery, every surge, every moment of doubt had led here, proving that the voiceless could claim their place and change the world with nothing but truth spoken to the sea. Kaelen lifted the crown of intertwined silver and sapphire, his hands steady as he placed it upon her head, the metal cool against her brow, yet warming instantly to her skin, as if the deep itself blessed the union. "You stand before us all as queen," he declared, his voice resonant and filled with the depth of his redemption carrying across the hall, so every noble and scholar could hear. Lira, whose whisper calmed the blockade, and whose light has shown us the error of our old ways. From this day she rules beside me, not as a banished scholar, but as the equal partner who has taught a king humility and a kingdom hope. The court erupted in applause, some faces still carrying traces of hesitation, but many more softened with genuine respect, as Sira, the elder Omega from the cliffside settlement, stepped forward with a small group of former outcasts, their simple garments contrasting the finery, yet shining with quiet pride. Lira's heart swelled at the sight, the chosen family that had sustained her in exile now witnessing her rise, and she reached out to take Sira's hands in hers, the emotional dialogue flowing like a gentle current of healing. "Sira, you who comforted me when the world cast me out," she said, her tones soft yet empowering, laced with the poetic resonance of the Tidekeeper's whisper. "Today we begin rewriting what was written in silence. No longer will Omega's labor unseen, or the fearful be shamed for their caution. The laws will change because the voice of the powerless has proven stronger than any decree." Kaelen nodded, his gaze filled with pride as he stood beside her, the mate bond flaring with shared purpose, while the lead noble, now humbled from the public confrontation, stepped forward with a heavy scroll of royal edicts, his hands trembling slightly as he presented it. "Your Majesties," he began, his voice carrying reluctant acknowledgement, "the council has reviewed the proposed revisions as you commanded. Those who carry fear will gain rights to study the sea's ways without banishment, access to equal council seats, and protection from arbitrary exile. The old hierarchies that silenced the cautious will be dissolved." Lira felt the fulfillment of her journey crest within her like a wave of light chasing away the last shadows of trauma, the cinematic beauty of the hall alive with possibility as she unrolled the scroll and began to speak the changes aloud, her voice weaving the Tidekeeper's whisper into the formal declarations, making the words themselves glow faintly on the parchment. From this day forward, she proclaimed, every wolf, regardless of Alpha, Beta, or Omega station, shall have the right to approach the sea without fear. No ruler may dismiss a voice based on perceived weakness alone, and the cliffside settlements will receive resources equal to the capital, so no one remains invisible. The court listened in rapt silence, some nobles exchanging glances of surprise while others nodded with growing understanding as the laws took shape not through conquest, but through the empowering harmony she had brought from the depth. Kaelen placed his hand over hers on the scroll, the touch sending a surge of warmth through the bond. His emotional words meant for her alone, yet spoken publicly to seal the moment. "You have changed everything, Lira," He said, his tone thick with the love that had earned its place through trials and trust. I once rejected the bond out of blindness, but today I crown you queen because your light has redeemed us both. Together we will build a realm where fear is honored and every voice finds its power. Lira's inner thoughts bloomed with profound gratitude and strength the fulfilled journey from. A pressed silence to this crowning moment, transforming her into the powerful queen who would ensure the fearful never suffered as she once had. Yet as the applause swelled and the new laws were recorded with fresh ink, a messenger approached the dais. His steps hurried with news that the first mixed council would convene at dawn to ratify the new measures, while faint reports from the outer courts spoke of lingering pockets of resistance, now fading under the weight of widespread approval. The coronation had crowned her queen, and the first laws had begun their rewrite, but Lira felt the mate bond tighten with quiet resolve, knowing that while the foundation was laid, the full reshaping of the kingdom would demand one more stand before the legacy could truly dawn, leaving the hall alive with celebration and the subtle shadow of final opposition on the horizon. The council chamber hummed with a new energy the morning after the coronation, sunlight pouring through tall windows to bathe the long oak table in golden warmth, where once stern faces of noble and scholars now softened with tentative acceptance as scrolls of revised edicts lay open before them like bridges built from ancient whispers to future hope. Lira sat at the head beside King Kaelen, her crown resting lightly upon her brow, the subtle luminous aura from the ritual still glowing faintly around her like a quiet promise of balance restored. Her inner thoughts flowed with profound fulfillment, the journey that had carried her from the humiliated flight through pouring rain to this seat of power, now culminating in the deep reshaping of the kingdom she had once been cast from. Every law they approved today would echo through generations, proving that the voice of the powerless could rewrite what pride had written in stone, and she felt the weight of that legacy not as burden, but as the empowering light that had always lived within her, waiting to shine. The lead noble, now fully humbled from the public confrontation, cleared his throat, his hands steady as he presented the final measures, the very changes that would dissolve old hierarchies and lift the fearful into equality. The council has deliberated, your majesties, he said, his voice carrying genuine respect where mockery once lived. We approve the equal access to all coastal paths for omegas and betas alike, the formation of mixed councils where every station holds a voice, and the allocation of resources to the cliffside settlements so no one remains forgotten or shamed for their caution. These edicts will bind as law with your seal. Lira felt her heart swell with cinematic clarity, the hall alive with the soft rustle of quills signing parchment, the blue traces from the calmed harbor seeming to pulse in quiet approval, as if the sea itself witnessed the transformation. She leaned forward, her voice soft, yet resonant with the poetic depth of the Tidekeeper's whisper that wove naturally into her words, making the moment feel sacred and unbreakable. These measures are not gifts, she told the council, her tone laced with emotional truth that touched every ear. They are rights long overdue, the same rights I claimed through the sea you once dismissed. Let them stand as proof that from fear comes strength, and from the voiceless rises the power to heal a fractured realm. The nobles nodded, many with open admiration, as the scrolls received the royal seal, the approval sealing deeper impact across the kingdom, from capital halls to distant settlements where omegas would now approach the waves without fear of banishment. In the quiet that followed, Lira and a small group of former outcasts from the cliffside settlement were ushered in, their simple garments a reminder of the world Lira had left behind, yet their faces glowed with hope as they approached the table. Lira's eyes brimmed with tears as she took Lira's hands, the emotional scene unfolding like a gentle embrace between chosen family stronger than any bloodline. Child, you have done what we dared not dream, Lira whispered, her voice thick with gratitude that filled the chamber with warmth. We who labored unseen and whispered our fears in secret now stand as equals because your voice refused to stay silent. The others murmured agreement, sharing stories of late-night whispers to the waves and the quiet resilience that had sustained them through years of oppression, their words weaving a tapestry of shared triumph that deepened Lira's sense of purpose. "I carried your kindness with me through exile, Lira," replied her inner thoughts blooming with gratitude, the empowering realization that her rise lifted them all, transforming personal victory into collective light. "Together we will ensure no one whispers in shadows again." The dialogue hung in the air like a healing balm, bridging past trauma to future promise as Kaelen watched with quiet pride, his hand finding hers beneath the table, the slow burn romance that had grown through regret and respect, now culminating in a partnership forged in fire and harmony. Later, as the council dispersed and the outcasts departed with new scrolls of rights in hand, Kaelen drew Lira to a private alcove overlooking the harbor gardens, where sunlight danced on blooming tide flowers that mirrored the renewed realm below. His powerful frame relaxed beside her, the mate bond thrumming with deep emotional warmth as he turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the full redemption that had reshaped his soul. "Lira, you have not only changed the laws," he said, his voice low and sincere, carrying the quiet promise that sealed their bond. "You have changed me. I once rejected the pull between us out of blindness, but now I stand as your partner, in every sense equal in rule and in heart. Whatever future we build from this day, it will honor the voice you gave us all." She met his gaze, her heart opening fully to the earned intimacy, the cinematic beauty of the garden, framing their moment like a painting of hope restored. "And I choose to walk it with you," she replied, her tone soft with empowering love, the poetic resonance of her words blending with the faint echo of the Tidekeeper's whisper. "Our partnership will be the foundation where chosen family thrives and every wolf finds power in their truth." The promise lingered between them, a quiet vow that deepened their connection into something enduring and bright. Yet as the sun climbed higher, a messenger approached the alcove, his steps hurried with news that the first mixed council would convene at dawn to ratify the new measures, while faint reports from the outer court spoke of lingering pockets of resistance, now fading under the weight of widespread approval. Lira felt the mate bond strengthen with resolve. The laws, rewritten in light, had begun their lasting impact, but the full legacy of their shared future awaited in the sanctuary they would build together, leaving the kingdom on the threshold of a dawn where voices once silenced would echo forever in halls of equality and hope. The sun rose over the newly named Academy of Tides like a golden promise, painting the cliffside settlement in soft hues of hope. Where once simple huts had stood, now rose elegant halls of stone and glass, open to every wolf who wished to learn the sea's ancient whispers and the forgotten stories that had long been silenced. Lira walked the wide pathways, her hand resting gently on the swell of her belly where the first air stirred with quiet strength, the subtle luminous aura from the ritual still glowing faintly around her like a crown of inner light that made the entire kingdom feel reborn. Her inner thoughts flowed with profound cinematic fulfillment, the journey from the rainy humiliation at the coastal ceremony where nobles had laughed and the king had banished her as ocean-fearing coward, to the storm-lashed cliffs where her whisper first stirred the deep, and the quiet nights when she had spoken her grief into the waves alone, now culminating in this legacy of light that lifted every fearful soul. "I have risen," she realized with overwhelming empowerment, the invisible Omega once mocked for her fear, now walking as queen beside the man who had redeemed his blindness through love and respect, proving that the voiceless could reshape the world into a sanctuary where chosen family thrived beyond bloodline. The academy buzzed with life, young Omegas and Alphas studying side by side, their laughter mingling with the soft whispers of Tidekeeper phrases that echoed through sunlit classrooms, the equal council chambers nearby filled with representatives from every station debating laws with voices once dismissed, now carrying equal weight in decisions that shaped the realm. Sira, the elder Omega who had comforted her in exile, led a group of former outcasts through the gardens, their faces radiant as they tended blooms that symbolized renewal, the emotional scenes unfolding like gentle waves of healing that washed away years of oppression. Lira paused to embrace her, the warmth of their chosen family bond stronger than any royal decree, as she spoke with poetic depth. "Sira, look at what we have built together. She said, her tone soft yet resonant with the empowering truth that had carried her through every trial. No longer will any wolf labor unseen or whisper fears in secret. This academy stands as proof that the powerless hold the greatest light, and the equal council ensures every voice finds its place at the table. Kaelen joined them, his powerful frame relaxed in simple robes, the mate bond humming with deep emotional warmth as he placed a protective hand over Lira's on her belly, the slow burn romance that had earned its place through regret and shared purpose now blooming into quiet partnership. He smiled at the sight of the children running through the paths, their laughter a melody of hope. The first mixed council session of the day already underway inside the hall, where alphas, betas, and omegas debated resource allocations with respect that had once seemed impossible. "You have given us all a future we never dared dream," he murmured, his voice thick with the redemption that had reshaped his rule, his inner perspective in this legacy moment filled with awe at the woman who had transformed his kingdom from one of pride to one of harmony. "The heir you carry will inherit not a throne of fear, but a realm where every soul is seen and heard, because of the whisper that refused to stay silent." Lira felt the child kick gently, as if sensing the bright horizon ahead, her heart swelling with cinematic clarity, the academy gardens stretching toward distant cliffs where new sanctuaries rose. For scholars of all stations, the equal council chambers alive with debates that wove the Tidekeeper's language into modern laws, protecting the fearful and lifting the oppressed. In the naming ceremony held at sunset in the sacred tidal pool, the gathered wolves watched as Kaelen lifted the newborn era boy with eyes that already held the spark of ancient wisdom and declared him heir to a legacy of tides united. Lira stood beside him, her hand on the child's head, the subtle aura glowing brighter as she whispered the first protective phrases of the Tidekeeper's gift, blessing him with harmony and strength. The emotional moment painting the chamber in soft blue light that mirrored the calm sea now resting peacefully beyond the harbor. "This child will know a world where power is shared," she thought, the inner voice rising like a triumphant hymn, the journey from banished scholar to powerful queen complete in its empowering arc, proving that redemption through transformation and the voice of the voiceless could create a bright future where chosen family mattered more than any old bloodline. The ceremony ended with cheers echoing through the halls, the equal council members stepping forward to present gifts of shells and scrolls symbolizing growth and knowledge for all as the sun dipped low, casting a hopeful horizon over the kingdom where cliffside settlements now thrived with equal resources and no one walked invisible. Lira leaned into Kaelen's side, the mate bond singing with enduring love as they looked out over the transformed realm, the academy lights twinkling like stars brought to earth, the sanctuary halls filled with students studying late into the night, the equal council planning further reforms that would ensure equality for generations. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.